Good morning, and welcome to a conversation on the environment and environmental regulation. I'm Adam White, a resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute. On behalf of AEI, it's my pleasure to welcome you and also to welcome our featured guest, the Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, Andrew Wheeler. This year marks the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's creation of the EPA. The EPA's work epitomizes the challenges of modern administration. Challenges of expertise and democratic accountability, regulatory responsiveness and the rules of law, government power and individual liberty, and also conservation and innovation. To discuss the EPA's mission, its record, and the road ahead, I'm pleased to be joined by Administrator Wheeler. He'll offer some opening remarks, and then I'll have some questions. And you can ask questions too, as you can see on our event page and on our YouTube page. Send questions on Twitter at hashtag AEI Clean Air and Water, or by email to elaine.allen@aei.org. But first, some opening remarks. Administrator Wheeler, welcome.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for the introduction, and I want to thank AEI for inviting me to be here today. Earlier this month, I provided reflections on the last 50 years of the Environmental Protection Agency and laid out our plan for its future at the Nixon Library. Today, I would like to explain, based on what we have accomplished over the past 4 years, how we are going to get to this future. It is incontrovertible that today the environment is in better shape under President Trump than we found it. Since 2017, air pollution in this country has fallen 7%. Last year, EPA delisted 27 Superfund sites, the most in a single year since 2001, and we will delist another 27 sites this year. EPA has helped finance more than $40 billion in clean water infrastructure, supporting 7,100 high-priority projects and 27,000 jobs during President Trump's first term. And the Trump EPA has recovered more criminal and civil penalties for enforcement in our first term than the Obama-Biden administration did in their first term. These successes are a big deal and great news in terms of America's health and well-being. But like most great news, you rarely read about it in newspapers or watch it on news channels. In fact, the news media purposefully underreports any good news from this administration. Just last week, we announced the second largest civil action under the Clean Air Act. The Trump administration has now collected more in civil and criminal penalties than the Obama-Biden administration did in its first term, but no press outlets reported this fact because it doesn't fit the press narrative. A big deal was made when President Trump left the Paris Climate Accords, which would have treated the U.S. economy unfairly. Yet the U.S. has seen a 15% reduction in energy-related carbon dioxide emissions since 2005. During this time, the U.S. cut its greenhouse gas emissions measured in tons more than Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Canada combined. China, meanwhile, has increased their emissions by over 50% since 2005. And just at EPA, the Trump administration in its first term has taken 4 concrete actions to reduce greenhouse gases. First, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, or ACE rule, which will cut overall carbon emissions from the U.S. power sector by 34% from 2005 levels by 2030. Second, our Safe Vehicles Rule will reduce emissions compared to the previous administration's standards, which allowed companies to comply through purchasing credits related to actions that didn't really impact emissions or by paying fines. Third, we proposed a new rule to reduce emissions from aircraft that represents the first time the U.S. has ever adopted emission standards for aviation. And fourth, the new rules making it easier and less expensive for natural gas companies to capture fugitive methane emissions from natural gas infrastructure. As John Adams once said, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. It's unfortunate, but there's a lot of evidence that during the previous administration, especially in its second term, an overweening focus on climate change that took the form of virtue signaling in foreign capitals. This behavior came at the expense of running the agency and ensuring a better environment for all Americans. Aside from their attempt at the Waters of the United States rule, they almost solely focused on climate change at the expense of other environmental indicators. And let me explain. We have done more in the first 4 years of the Trump administration to improve the environment than probably any administration, except perhaps during the very first years of EPA. I would argue that the Trump administration has epitomized and carried out more than any other administration the core mission of the EPA, which is to protect human health and the environment. We have finalized at least 8 major rulemakings before the end of this term: the Navigable Waters Rule, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, the SAFE Rule, the first 10 TSCA assessments, the CCR and ELG rules, the Lead and Copper Rule, the Ozone NACs, and the PM NACs will all be finalized by the end of this year. All of these regulations will improve the environment. At the same time, we inherited the largest backlog of unfinished agency business in our history. During the final 4 years of the Obama administration, an enormous backlog of unprocessed permits of all kinds was built up. For example, at the beginning of this administration, we inherited a backlog of 700 state implementation plans, also known as SIPs, under the Clean Air Act. We have taken action on over 500 of these submittals. States and cities need the SIPs approved so that they can focus on cleaning up their environment. When SIPs languish at EPA for approval, environmental work may not be getting done, and approval of SIPs can help reduce air pollution. When cities and counties fall out of attainment, companies shut or move their facilities other places rather than wait for air quality levels to improve. One of the causes of urban decline in places like Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was the inability of businesses to get new permits. This backlog of SIPs at the agency has been one of the invisible but real causes of environmental injustice in this country over the past several decades. Any location that was out of air attainment could not make it back into attainment unless SIPs were first processed and then a plan carried out. Many of these backlog plans sat for years in limbo, neither approved nor rejected for a variety of reasons, including because they were deficient and could not be approved. But instead of approving these plans or disapproving them and developing new ones, prior administrations just let them sit, sometimes for decades. We discovered applications that were filed in the 1990s and unprocessed in places like San Joaquin Valley in California and in Arizona. In 2018, we approved a SIP that was filed by Wyoming in 1987. And we discovered an unprocessed SIP for Nevada from October 1975, 45 years ago. Concerning water pollution, the backlog of the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permits, which regulates point sources of pollution in the U.S. waters, has been reduced 32% from 2017. Regarding Superfund cleanups, we see a similar story. Too many Americans have lived near Superfund sites for too long. Thankfully, cleaning up these sites has been a major focus of the Trump administration. In President Trump's first 3 years in office, we completed full or partial deletion of 55 sites from the NPL, National Priorities List, including 27 last year, the most in a single year since 2001. Of the 27 sites deleted last year, 14 sites have been on the list since the 1980s, 7 since the 1990s. We have maintained last year's accelerated pace and will have completed the deletion process for another 27 full or partial sites by the end of this fiscal year. This will bring the total number of full or partial deletions in President Trump's first term to at least 82 sites. This is equal to the 8-year total of the prior administration. So it's worth repeating. The Trump administration in its first 4 years has matched the amount of Superfund sites delisted by the Obama-Biden administration in its 8 years in office. And many of the sites delisted this year have been on the NPL for more than 30 years. A full or partial deletion of a site tells local communities and the broader public that important work has been done and the site, if appropriate, is eligible for brownfields funding and can be freed of the stigma of being a Superfund site. And when you reflect on how many of the most polluted and hazardous sites EPA has responsibility for are in some of the most disadvantaged communities in this country, you start to realize how important a mission EPA has been given by Congress. When we clean up polluted sites quickly and return them to the surrounding communities for an improved use, EPA is strengthening our country where it needs to be strongest, at our foundation. There are many other examples of our working down of this backlog. The PFAS family of chemicals has been around since at least the 1950s, and no administration ever took them on. In 2019, we took the historic step of creating a PFAS action plan that uses all of our program offices to deal with this emerging chemical of concern. The action plan outlines more than 20 key focus areas that include both short and long-term goals, and is the agency's first multi-program national research and risk communication plan. Concerning lead and copper pipes, the Biden administration claimed to have worked on it for 8 years with nothing to show. They even had a wake-up call in Flint, Michigan in 2014, but still did nothing. We will finalize our lead and copper rule in the next several weeks, which for the first time ever will call for the testing of lead in all schools and daycare centers. We delivered a final rule in April 2019, strengthening asbestos regulations for the first time in over 30 years. This rule closed a dangerous loophole that could have allowed contaminated floor tiles, building materials, and insulation to return to the U.S. marketplace without going through EPA review. We have completely eliminated the backlog of EPA actions on the state's list of impaired waters, marking the first time in a decade that this backlog has been eliminated. Since January of 2017, EPA has approved more than 7,000 TMDLs, or total maximum daily load plans, to restore polluted waters, a 25% increase from the preceding 3.5 years. The backlog of actions on state priority TMDLs has fallen dramatically from over 100 in 2017 to just a single state priority TMDL in July of this year. That's more than a 99% decrease in the backlog. And we're doing so while approving a higher percentage of state water quality standards than at any point during the last administration. Yet despite our significant efforts to update water standards, some states are actively trying to derail one of the nation's most successful watershed partnerships by bringing a frivolous and divisive lawsuit over the Chesapeake Bay's TMDLs. The historic progress in restoring the Chesapeake Bay in the past decade is evidence of how strong partnerships with states can create better environmental outcomes. So it's unfortunate that some downstream states choose politics over progress in an election year and sued EPA over a position actually developed by the Obama administration a few years ago. On a more positive note, we are supporting American energy by reducing the underground injection control, or UIC Class II permit backlog by 70% since the beginning of the administration. We cut the length of time to process a UIC Class II permit to less than 150 days, down from the average of 500 days in the past. In January of 2017, the backlog of new chemicals under review for greater than 90 days had grown to over 500. As of today, the number of chemicals EPA has under review for over 90 days is less than 200, a 60% decrease, and the agency has completed over 2,900 new chemical submissions since the beginning of this administration. And when it comes to enforcement, we have reversed the decline in the EPA criminal program that began in 2011 by bringing on new agents. In 2019, the number of new criminal cases opened increased for the first time since 2013, with a 48% increase since 2017 in the number of new criminal cases on potential environmental crimes opened by EPA. And it turns out, delivering for American communities also means there are things that we are not doing. We are not weaponizing enforcement or using it for social engineering. We are simply using our enforcement and compliance tools to solve environmental problems like non-attainment, protect drinking water, reduce lead exposure, and revitalizing communities. And these accomplishments could not have happened without the hard work of our career employees. By implementing the lean management system across the agency in 2017, we freed up many of the bureaucratic obstacles that have plagued this agency for so long. Now, this is a lot of information in detail, but it is only by being honest about the past that we can ensure for a better future for the communities in this country that have been left behind. Because it goes without saying that America is a nation made up of communities, and communities are the foundation of our nation, not the other way around. This is an issue at the core of our country's fight for environmental justice. After my speech at the Nixon Library, I was criticized by some in the press on our environmental justice record. The Trump administration has done more to elevate environmental justice than any president since George H.W. Bush created the program. First, we elevated environmental justice out of the enforcement office and into the administrator's office. Being stuck in enforcement relegated environmental justice to be considered after the fact instead of at the beginning of our policies and rulemakings. Second, the opportunity zone tax credits created by the Trump tax reform of 2017 has done more to help environmental justice communities with their environmental problems than all the EJ grants of the past many years. Third, the America's Water Infrastructure Act, which was signed into law by President Trump in 2018, codified the Office of Environmental Justice within EPA for the first time. We are incorporating environmental justice through our program offices and improving EJ communities at a pace not seen before. Just look at some of our Superfund sites. In North Birmingham, Alabama, the community that is the site of the infamous bombings in 1963 that killed 4 girls attending the 16th Street Baptist Church, we've cleaned up 480 properties and removed more than 60,000 tons of soil contaminated with lead, arsenic, and other heavy metals from that community. At the USS Lead site in East Chicago, Indiana, we've cleaned up 671 residential properties and removed contaminated soil from 95% of the Calumet neighborhood, allowing the city to redevelop vacant lots. At the Southside Chattanooga Lead site in Tennessee, we've cleaned up lead contamination in 8 historically black low-income residential neighborhoods, parks, schools, playgrounds, and daycares, and added the site to the national priority list. In Pueblo, Colorado's low-income Bessemer neighborhood, EPA accelerated the cleanup of 1,900 residential and commercial properties polluted with lead and arsenic by a smelter which closed almost a century ago. The decision accelerated the cleanup's completion by almost 7 years. And in Atlanta, Georgia, in only 2 short years, since a doctoral student raised awareness of lead levels in the city's west side neighborhoods, EPA has already removed contaminated soil from over 140 properties. When I visited the site last year, I got to see firsthand the work EPA was doing to get sampling and cleanup underway to protect the health and safety of those living in the English Avenue and Vine City communities, which are among the city's poorest. On water with environmental justice, our Region 2 office worked to help over 200 of the poorest communities in Puerto Rico recover from the devastating hurricanes of 2017. By partnering with NGOs, we helped provide solar panels and battery storage for water systems, allowing them to continue to provide water during power outages. And with our lead and copper rule, we focused our attention on ways to ensure the worst contaminated pipes aren't the last miles replaced in the next 30 years, because everyone, regardless of their zip code, deserves safe drinking water. Regarding air quality, as we've seen, moving locations from non-attainment to attainment status predominantly helps inner cities, which is why it was so frustrating to see previous administrations not focus on this. Since 2017, we've taken action over 1,200 SIPs, both new and backlog. We've redesignated 54 non-attainment areas to attainment during this time, and we believe another 25 areas can be redesignated by 2022. Areas that have regained air attainment include Indianapolis, which re-entered attainment for sulfur dioxide in May of this year, Chicago and Tampa regained attainment for lead in 2018, and St. Louis and Cleveland for particulate matter in 2019. Meeting these standards protects people from asthma, heart and lung disease, heart attacks, behavior and learning problems, and a whole host of other health issues. It's my belief that if we want to help communities in the future, We need to recognize where we made mistakes in the past. It goes without saying that neglect is a form of harm, and it's not fair to act in ways that harm communities just because they don't have enough political power to stop the neglect. What we should be striving for at EPA in the coming years is a community-driven environmentalism that promotes community revitalization. This will do more for environmental justice than all the rhetoric in political campaigns. What we have in the United States in terms of the environment is unique, and I want to conserve it for future generations. But I also want more recognition and attention put towards the areas of the country that are still polluted and still need our help, 50 years after EPA's creation. Our environment in the United States, taken as a whole, is much cleaner than other great powers and cleaner than most of the rich industrialized economies around the world. But we are at an inflection point in the direction we are going as a nation regarding environmental protection. I have a clear vision for EPA. It involves focusing on communities and citizens here in the United States. For its 50th anniversary commemoration this year, we selected a very good slogan, Progress for a Stronger Future. Just last week, I was in St. Louis talking with faith leaders and learning about some of the environmental training our Region 7 office is doing with religious organizations in Missouri. The pandemic has hurt church finances like it has everywhere else, and the ability to develop better environmental behaviors, energy savings, and money-saving measures helps churches keep their doors open. EPA working with faith-based groups is what it means to be strengthening the foundation of our communities. We are doing it, and it's great to see. And I'm reminded by something Alex de Tocqueville wrote after visiting America almost 2 centuries ago. Quote, "The health of a democratic society may be measured by the quality of functions performed by private citizens." Focusing on communities, the vital work of implementing environmental laws and working with states and local governments to help communities help themselves is the best way to improve the quality of the environment, both physical and even spiritual, across our nation. This will take some time. It's a redirection of not just human resources, but our emotional resources, because in some ways, it's heartbreaking to see these communities with environmental pollution continue to suffer and to feel abandoned while other places prosper. But if you want to know the proper role for the administrative state in the 21st century, this is it. I believe that focusing EPA towards communities in the coming years, our agency can change the future for people living in this country who have been left behind simply for living in polluted places. As I've said several times in the past, everyone deserves to have a clean environment regardless of what zip code they live in. We will do work that has been neglected for years, and we will do it with a durability that can withstand the future environmental challenges our nation will face, even those we cannot now imagine or anticipate. If we can do the work before us, eliminate the agency backlogs that are at the root of so many perverse environmental outcomes in this country, we can protect the places we love and bring back the places that have been hurt by pollution. Bring them all the way back to the places they were before the pollution began. I want to thank you for the invitation to speak today with all of you, and thank you very much for being here and listening in.
Thank you, Administrator Wheeler. While you take your seat, to be very clear, save 6 feet away from mine. I thought originally that I'd ask about some of the more current issues, issues of more recent vintage, issues of climate change and so on, and we'll get to those in a moment. But since you focus so much on Superfund, maybe we'll start with that. It seems these days debates around the EPA do focus on some of the more recent issues, but Superfund has been a thorny problem for the nation for a long time, or the administration of Superfund to remedy some of these harms. Why has it been such a difficult program to administer, and why was this administration so successful in turning it around?
I think we've been successful in turning it around because we're focusing on the results, not on the activities of the program. The program has been is actually celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, and it's done some great things over the 40 years. But it has focused on measuring activities on a site-by-site basis instead of focusing on getting those sites cleaned up. I was actually, after my Nixon speech, I was attacked by some of the former EPA staff, led by some of the former political people. One of the career staff, Betsy Sutherland, said that the number of Superfund constructions has declined under our administration. That is an activity that is not related to the result of getting the site cleaned up. is Superfund construction, if I can just explain briefly.
Yeah, of course.
When we install, for example, when there's groundwater pollution and we install a pump and treat system at the site. So we install the equipment. As soon as the equipment is installed, that's a construction completion. Then the equipment operates for years, sometimes decades, depending on the site. So it's not until all the water has been treated is the site cleaned up. So in the past, some of our critics are pointing to a meaningless statistic. Of course, all the pump and treat, most of them were installed years ago. So the number of constructions would necessarily go down.
Right.
But that is, she actually made the case for me without knowing, because she focused on an outdated activity that is not a measure of the success of the program by cleaning up, but the results of getting the sites cleaned up.
Now, since you mentioned criticism from former EPA staff, maybe that leads naturally into my next question. How to think about the relationship between the leadership of the EPA and the civil servants and over time. Just a few days ago, it was Constitution Day, and one of your colleagues in the cabinet, Attorney General Barr, dedicated an entire speech to thinking through the relationship between the leadership of an agency and the career staff, the experts, and others within the agency. How do you think of that relationship between the politically accountable leadership who are appointed through the constitutional process and those who serve in the agency often from one administration to the next to the next?
We have, I believe, some of the most dedicated federal employees at EPA. People come to work at EPA because they're concerned about the environment. And they are, all the accomplishments that I mentioned today, we could not have done those without the dedication of our career employees. What I have seen with, we have turned around the agency in terms of how we deal with permits, and that's hard work. What we did was we implemented the lean management system, and our middle managers are very excited about that. They now have a tool that they can use in order to solve a problem, and they're using it, and it's effective. And what I've seen in some of the recent, maybe some of the retirements, because people didn't want to change. They didn't want to embrace environmentalism for the 21st century. They're stuck in processes of the past. And I think you see that in some of the criticisms. A perfect example, again, is that Superfund criticism. Some of the people that have left the agency are stuck in the mindset of measuring activities and not focusing on results. And I think we have some very dedicated career employees at the agency who are really now focusing on the results in their jobs.
Before we get too far from the Superfund conversation, maybe also we'll talk about another recent crisis, and that was the crisis in Flint, Michigan. It happened a few years ago. It's taken real effort by the Trump administration to follow this up and actually deal with the problem. What lessons can be learned from that crisis, both in terms of protecting the environment and then responding when accidents happen?
Sure. So the lead and copper rule had not been updated in over 20 years, and we're going to update it. We proposed it last year. It will be finalized sometime in the next few weeks, and it will really focus on getting the lead pipes replaced around the country. But it also has a few other very important measures, including testing in all schools and daycare centers. But, the Flint, Michigan problem, EPA was, at the time, people at the agency were notified of the problem, and they didn't act quickly, and they needed to. When we were faced with a very similar problem in New Jersey and Newark, when they had lead in their pipes last year, and when we forced them to deliver bottled water to their residents until we could figure out the source of the problem and the remedy, they were hesitant to do that at first. We stepped in and said, no, we're not going to have something like Flint, Michigan happen again. We have to take this seriously. So we're working with water systems across the country to make sure that something like that never happens again.
And when you say working with water systems, one thing the EPA deals with as much as, if not more than other agencies, is this complex mix of authority, the federal government, state governments, state legislatures, state commissions, local districts, and so on. How should we think about the federalism of this whole process? What's the proper role for the EPA, the states, and the localities?
So, and I could probably talk another hour on this topic. I'll try to keep it short, but we do our best work when we're working in cooperation with the states and local governments, and we see that in the Superfund program. We see that in the AIR program. The EPA, under our EPA, we reorganize our regional offices to mirror headquarters. And some of the states are now doing the same. But the problem that we've had, and this is a problem at all levels of government, when EPA was created, we were very siloed in our approach. We had our air office, our water office, our chemicals office, our land and hazardous waste office. And we've not done a good job of working across the offices. Our PFAS action plan that we released a year and a half ago actually used people from all of the offices. We've got to figure out a way of doing that on a daily basis, not just when a large incident like PFAS occurs. So we have to be more nimble. We've also, we've decreased, I didn't talk about just our general permits, we've decreased our permit backlog over 50%. But the thing is, today, almost all permits are done by the states. The states do 96 to 97% of the water permits, and all but 2 states have the air program delegated to them, so they do the air permits. When we do a review on the state delegated programs, historically, we've only looked at their enforcement data. Starting next year, we will also start looking at their permitting data to see how they are processing the permits. Because if they're stepping into the role of the federal government on the clean water and the clean air side, and they're issuing the permits in our shoes, then we need to make sure that they're doing it in a thoughtful manner and probably faster than what they've been able to accomplish in the past.
And as you mentioned in your remarks, before a state can start implementing the law in the shoes of the EPA, oftentimes it needs to receive federal approval for a state implementation plan. This has also been a thorny problem for years and years. There's a constant sort of tension between the federal government setting standards but leaving the states with real authority to figure out how best to attain those standards, right? I guess it's the best of both worlds. Federal standards but state flexibility. And in recent years, I think the balance has probably gone in the wrong direction too often, with the EPA really trying to micromanage the states, in addition to the problems of the backlogs of the SIPs, as you mentioned. So what's been the most difficult part about turning that around in the last few years and making not just the SIP approval process more efficient and productive, but also just in approving the SIPs themselves and making sure the states have flexibility?
Well, a perfect example there is if we don't approve a state SIP, the EPA can issue a FIP, a Federal Implementation Plan. And the Obama-Biden administration issued 10 times the number of FIPs as the 4 previous administrations combined. So since March of 2017, on average, we've taken 1 FIP and turned it back into a SIP. So we are reducing the number of FIPs that are out there, which is when the federal government just tells the state, you must do this, which is not the right approach. So we are converting those FIPs that the Obama administration issued into SIPs, working with the states in a cooperative manner. And I think that's what the Clean Air Act envisioned. A FIP is supposed to be a last course, desperate measure by the EPA, and that seemed to be the first action of the Obama administration. They sat on all the SIPs and they just issued their own FIPs. We've turned that around, and I think that's the right approach for EPA, is to be working cooperatively with the states as they develop their SIPs before they even submit them to us, and then work with them after they've submitted them to us to make sure that we can approve them.
But it doesn't water down the actual protection that people are getting within the states?
Absolutely not, because the SIP has to show how they will reach attainment for the NAAQS standards. And as shown by the number of non-attainment designations that we've done in reversing them from non-attainment to attainment, it proves that the air has gotten better. And as I said, the air pollution today, and it's the way the EPA has been monitoring air pollution for the last 50 years, it's 7% cleaner than it was at the beginning of the administration, of this administration. And since EPA was founded 50 years ago, air pollution has been reduced 77%. Again, 7% under this administration.
Now let's take a step back and situate the EPA in our constitutional structure within the executive branch. Agencies like the EPA have long operated under executive orders, but this administration began with a number of executive orders focused on the substance of regulation, not just the EPA. It was on financial regulation, principles for financial regulation, and so on. But the EPA was among the number of agencies that were the subject of executive orders on energy independence, on the Waters of the United States rule, where President Trump signed orders directing agencies to start a process and really to focus on the priorities of the administration. And so that then is followed by the rulemaking process. And now a number of those rules have been completed, America's Clean Energy Rule, the new Navigable Waters Rule, and so on. How has that whole process worked out, and in terms of the actual process of beginning with the White House and then going through the agencies. How does that improve the process?
Well, for this administration in particular, it was vital that first year to have those executive orders, in large part because we did not have the political leadership at EPA for the first year. My predecessor, Scott Pruitt, was confirmed in March of 2017. Our next Senate confirmed person was not confirmed until November. That's never happened before. Senator Schumer and the Senate Democrats purposefully held up our Senate nominees for the agencies. So we did not have that senior leadership. So it's very important to have those executive orders by the White House to direct the staff that was at EPA to work on the issues and for example, start working on WOTUS. So it was very important to have those executive orders in place because we did not have Senate-confirmed people because the Senate Democrats held up all of our nominees.
We'll get back to the rulemaking process in a moment. Let's focus on this for a moment. What happens when an agency lacks that top tier of Senate-confirmed officials?
Well, you usually don't see a lot of movement in those offices when you don't have a Senate-confirmed person. We didn't get our Senate-confirmed head of enforcement office until December of 2017. So I like to refer to 2017 because our enforcement numbers dropped that year. We didn't have the leadership in that office. I consider those to be the Schumer enforcement numbers. Once we got the head of our enforcement office confirmed that December, and we started in 2018, our enforcement numbers went up. We started hiring more criminal enforcement agents. That went up. So we've accomplished a lot. In fact, I said more than the Obama-Biden administration on civil and criminal enforcement dollars collected. I was not counting the VW settlement, which was the first year of our administration. Most of the work took place during the Obama administration. And I did not count the Daimler settlement last week because the court hasn't finalized that. Once the Daimler settlement is finalized, though, we will have collected twice as much in enforcement fines as the Obama-Biden administration did in their first 4 years.
Now, about those rules we alluded to just a moment ago, especially the America's Clean Energy Rule and the new Navigable Waters Rule. If I remember correctly, the ACE rule, the climate rule, that's in the D.C. Circuit. It's going to be argued in October.
Yes.
The Navigable Waters Rule, I don't think that's in the D.C. Circuit. That one's probably out west in the 9th. In a nutshell, how would you describe what's been achieved in those rules, and why should the court sustain them?
Well, on the ACE rule, for example, we replaced the Clean Power Plan.
Yeah.
And I get criticized a lot for replacing that, but people need to remember that the Supreme Court issued a stay on the Clean Power Plan. It never took effect. Mm-hmm. That's the first time they've ever done that for an environmental regulation. So I look at that as the Supreme Court saying the Obama administration went outside the bounds of the Clean Air Act. So what we did at the very beginning of this administration is take a look at what the Clean Air Act said, and we formulated the ACE rule, which follows the law, and I believe will be upheld by the D.C. Circuit and the Supreme Court if it goes to the Supreme Court. On the water side, as soon as the Obama administration issued their WOTUS rule, it was stayed in almost first in every state, and then eventually over half the states. It was stayed. It didn't take effect either. Yeah. The lawsuit to stay our replacement for that rule failed in the courts. So our rule is the law of the land. And what we did for our navigable waters protection rule is something that I like to joke is apparently unique, is we took a hard look at the Clean Water Act, and we took a hard look at the Supreme Court cases. And we wrote the rule to follow the law, both the Clean Water Act and the Supreme Court cases. So I believe our replacement for the WOTUS rule, our navigable waters protection rule, will be upheld by the Supreme Court.
Right. Now, I have just a couple more minutes of questions before we go to audience questions. I do want to remind our audience, if they would like to send in questions, they can do it on Twitter at hashtag AEI Clean Air and Water, or by email to elaine.allen at aei.org. About that stay that the Supreme Court issued for the Clean Power Plan, I think it's very easy to draw a line to that moment from an earlier moment at the EPA. With all due respect, I don't think it was one of the EPA's greatest moments. It was when the EPA lost in the Supreme Court in a case called Michigan versus EPA. It had to do with stationary sources. The EPA lost. The court ruled that it had gone past the limits of the statute. And somebody at the EPA, if I remember correctly, said, well, even though we lost the case, the industry has fully complied with the rule, and so we really didn't lose anything at all. I think that was a real blow to the credibility of the EPA at the time, a few years ago, and I think that's why the court might have been more skeptical. But it also reminds us of this delicate balance of the EPA, where when it issues a rule, it promulgates standards. You want to begin compliance, but we have a whole process after that, oftentimes for judicial review and so on. What's the right way to do this? What's the right way for the agency to make rules and try to start ushering the industry towards compliance, but recognizing that there's a whole rule of law process that follows?
You know, you're absolutely correct. And that Supreme Court decision, and I said at the time, I was in the private sector, and I wrote a piece on it, that I felt that Justice Scalia was not writing for that case. He was writing for the case that they were going to get on the Clean Power Plan.
Yeah, I thought so.
Some of the comments he made in his opinion. And that was wrong. It was wrong of the EPA. And, you know, at the time, you know, I think you're referring to the MATS rule, the Mercury Air Toxics rule. At the time, you know, the EPA Administrator said it doesn't, you're exactly right, it was actually the EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, who said, you know, the industry's already complied with it, so the court decision doesn't really matter. And I think that infuriated the Supreme Court, and why they stayed the Clean Power Plan. And I know there are people who worked on the Clean Power Plan, and I heard this when I was on the outside, who felt that the Clean Power Plan, because it went outside the fence line, which the agency had never done under the Clean Air Act, that they knew it was going to get overturned, but they were hoping that the utility industry would comply with it before the Supreme Court overturned it. And that is not the way a regulatory agency should operate. I think that is out of bounds. We should be following the law. Congress sets the laws. We have to we have to want to enforce them, but we have to enact them. And it is inappropriate for the agency, for any regulatory agency, to knowingly go beyond what the law states. And the EPA certainly did that in a few cases.
Maybe we'll end this part of the conversation on this then, on a related theme. The industries that the EPA regulates are often among the most capital-intensive industries in the country. These industries have to make long-term plans, strategic deployment, investment of capital and other resources, choices that are going to have consequences for many, many, many years, oftentimes a planning horizon well beyond 4 or 8 years.
Absolutely.
And so regulatory uncertainty is just it's an inevitable problem. How can we minimize this problem of regulatory uncertainty in environmental regulation?
Well, I think we have to be more open with how our regulations are developed. And some of the reforms that we're doing that I didn't discuss today include our science transparency regulation, our cost-benefit regulation, the fact that we're now putting all of our guidance documents out on a searchable database. This should provide more transparency and openness, not just to the regulated industry, but also to the environmental groups and the private citizens around the country. And by having that transparency, you know, I started my career at EPA back in the early 90s. I'm working on TSCA and TRI, the Community Right to Know Act. I fundamentally believe that the public has a right to know what the basis is for our regulations, which is why we're moving forward on all of those reforms. Because I believe if we tell the public what scientific studies we're using, and here's the data behind those studies, then our regulations will be better accepted. And I think that will help provide more certainty to the regulated community through our process if we are more upfront with how we make decisions and put that into our rulemakings.
Maybe we'll talk about the scientific transparency rule for just a moment. That's a rule that I liked the concept of it. I've spoken out in favor of it before you proposed anything, and I've spoken out in favor of the proposal, to be quite honest.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. But in when I speak out in favor of it, I always have to make the concession that I think is inevitable, that just the mere fact of creating a rule that has standards for what scientific studies can and can't be used, and putting limits on studies that might well be valid science but aren't publicly available, there is a cost in that. The benefit is transparency, the benefit is public accountability, but it is going to have some impacts, surely, on the way that science is produced and disseminated and used in government. So how can we ensure that we have transparent science that's still the best science?
Well, we do have, we did include in the proposal, and we did a supplemental proposal on this, to better clarify this, that the administrator can still, if a scientific study is important and needs to be used for regulation, we can waive the transparency part of that for that scientific study. Okay. But again, I believe that the majority of the people who are opposed to this would prefer decisions be made in a back room, the proverbial smoke-filled back room. You know, they don't want the agency to be upfront with how we make our decisions. They would prefer to be able to make decisions behind closed doors and then tell the public, this is what the regulation is, this is what the standard is. I fundamentally believe we need to explain the basis behind our regulations and our standards.
All right, so we'll have some audience questions then. Here's one, and it has to do with the widely discussed Green New Deal. There's been a lot of public debate and discussion around proposals like the Green New Deal, calling on the EPA to achieve, and then the federal government in general, to achieve goals of zero greenhouse gas emissions. How should we think about calls for that kind of reform, and how do they sort of stack up against what the EPA has accomplished in the last few years?
Sure. Of course, the devil's in the detail.
Right, of course.
And there's a couple of different versions of the Green New Deal out there. I've yet to see one that actually makes sense. But there's several versions of them, of the Green New Deals out there. You know, one of the things they call for is, you know, the end of the internal combustion engine. I believe by 2035 was one of the plans. That's not feasible. And as far as the zero emissions, we don't have the battery storage technology to get to that point. You know, a lot of people don't realize that there are negative impacts to the environment of every single energy source. Mm-hmm. The only one I can't figure out a negative impact to would be geothermal. And I'm sure if it was more widely used, there may end up being some negative impacts. But there are negative environmental impacts to wind, and there are negative environmental impacts to solar. And we never focus on that. We don't focus on the rare earth minerals that go into producing the renewable energy. We don't focus on the disposal of the solar panels after the end of their life expectancy, and the disposal of the wind turbines. We also don't focus on the impact on birds and bats from the wind turbines. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use wind and solar. I'm just saying that every single energy source has a negative consequence, and on the renewable side, we don't talk about that. That's glossed over. We should be open and upfront about the positives and negatives of all of our energy sources.
Maybe I'll follow that up. You mentioned the battery technology. It's true, batteries are not perfect yet, but they're getting better.
They are, and we need to get them even better.
Solar panels, the cost was higher before. It's coming down. All these technologies,
sure,
they're improving like technology often does. What's the right role for the EPA in helping to sort of advance the future without dictating the future? I remember a few years ago, a former EPA official who used to regulate the automobile, help the EPA with regulating automobiles. She published a memoir of her time at the EPA, and it was titled "Driving the Future," which I thought got it totally backwards. Government doesn't drive the future.
No.
But what role does the government have in helping to move towards the future?
I think we need to have standards in place that don't pick winners and losers, particularly in the energy sector. I think it's important for the federal government, and most of it through the Department of Energy, to help fund research to make batteries more efficient, to help fund research on solar panels, to help fund research on the use of coal and clean coal technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration. I think that's an appropriate role of the federal government to help spur that innovation in the marketplace. But I don't believe our regulations should pick winners and losers between the different types. There was one problem, one big problem with the Obama CAFE standards. If you were to get the emissions reductions that they called for, you'd have to have a 50% electric vehicle fleet by 2025. That's not going to happen. Yeah. So the only way the auto companies could comply with the Obama regulation was by cashing in credits unrelated to the vehicle miles or paying large fines. And the fines were expected to be $1 billion by 2025, which would have been passed on to all the consumers. That would have been built into the price of a new car.
Our next audience question comes from Oliver Millman. He's a writer for The Guardian. He says, the fourth National Climate Assessment, co-authored by EPA scientists, states that climate change has doubled the area burned by wildfire in the U.S. West since the 1980s. His question is, given the huge fires we're now seeing out west, do you consider wildfire smoke a major and growing public health threat?
There's several things in that question.
Right.
But his final question is on the health threat of the smoke. Absolutely. We actually, our career scientists developed an app that you can download. It's called Smoke Sense, that will give updates as to where you live and whether or not it's safe to go outside, and because of the particulate matter from the fires. Absolutely, the forest fires are creating a huge health issue in terms of particulate matter. I should have started with the loss of life from the fires. Yeah. And we're all very concerned about the loss of life and the emergency responders, but there's certainly an environmental impact, and that's in the smoke as well as impacts to water. After the wildfires in Colorado a few years back, they had water impacts for years afterwards. So there's a lot of environmental impacts, but I believe that the forest fires in the West are mostly caused by poor forest management and not from climate change.
Yeah, well, on that point, it seems such a difficult problem to untangle. There's, as the reporter mentions the climate aspect of this. There's the private sector, that's responsible for maintaining energy infrastructure within the states. And what should they be responsible for in keeping the area around lines clear? What's the responsibility of the state government, the private, the public sector, and so on? How does the EPA, how does the federal government as a whole even begin to grapple with an issue like that involves so many different private and state actors?
Well, that is mostly outside of the jurisdiction of EPA,
Right.
but you're right that it is a huge problem. When I was in the private sector, I worked on legislation that unfortunately was blocked by a number of environmentalists that would have allowed utilities to go in and clean out the dead debris near their lines.
Yeah.
They're not able to do that unless they own the property. If the line's crossing federal property, they don't have that authority because of liability reasons to do that. That is a huge problem. That's outside EPA's jurisdiction, but it's something that as a government we do need to focus on.
Another question, somebody does ask, what is the current status of the New Waters of the United States rule, and how has it evolved in recent years? I teach in my administrative law class at George Mason, so many of the cases are Clean Water Act cases, grappling with what is a navigable water, what is a water of the United States. Why has that been such a difficult problem for the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers to just settle through the rulemaking process in a way that survives judicial review, and why will this time be any different?
Well, I think this time will be different because we did follow the law and the Supreme Court cases. When you go back to the Clean Water Act written in the 1970s, navigable water, I think at that point, Congress was focusing on ships and boats on waterways. And it has been expanded over the years through Supreme Court cases to include adjacent wetlands and other waters that contribute to the waters of the U.S. Our definition, I believe, follows the Supreme Court cases. So I think it will be upheld. It's already passed the first test. It was not stayed by the district courts. At this point, we are in the middle of training and writing the guidance documents. I'm helping the Army Corps do that for the Army Corps inspectors around the country. Mm-hmm. I think it's very important that every Army Corps inspector follows the law the exact same way. In the past, and I saw this when I was in private practice, you had Army Corps inspectors that interpreted the regulations the way they wanted to interpret it on a case-by-case basis. We rewrote the New Waters of the U.S. Naval Waters Protection Act so that the property owner should be able to stand on his or her property and be able to tell for themselves whether or not their water falls under the definition. So we included what is a water of the U.S., and we included also what is not a water of the U.S. in the definition.
It seems to me that so much of the energy that was channeled into getting the EPA and the Army Corps to expand its view of navigable waters over the year, I mean, it was certainly well-intentioned and oftentimes was responsive to improving scientific understandings of how water flows, how bodies of water are connected. If only that had been channeled into the legislative process instead, Congress could have updated these standards. It seems to me, this is my editorial comment, that the more that the EPA and other agencies stay within their mandates and really justify why they're limited by those mandates, the more energy that you would hope would be channeled into a legislative process. But that's my editorial comment.
I'll let you make the editorial comment. I will say, with the Supreme Court decisions, what's written in the Clean Water Act has not kept up with the times.
Yeah. Another audience question. This comes from Chris Barnard, who's policy director at the American Conservation Coalition. He writes, how can we make sure we have a steady supply of critical minerals in the United States without being reliant on countries such as China? What's your view of domestic drilling? Maybe it means domestic mining.
Probably domestic mining.
But this goes to a problem you identified a moment ago, that the more we rely on these new technologies, the more we'll become reliant upon China and a few other foreign countries unless we're able to find technologies that can be based on a more diverse set and ideally domestic set of resources.
I mean, the pad that you're holding right now, uses rare earth minerals in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spoke at Cambridge University last year, and I had a young woman who said a fairly hostile question to me, and she read it on her iPhone. And I pointed out after I responded to her question, I pointed out at the end that if she's really that concerned about the environment, she might want to get rid of her iPhone because of the rare earth minerals. We need them, and we should be mining them here in the United States because we mine in a more environmentally protective manner than anywhere else in the world. When you look at the other countries that are mining these rare earth minerals, they are not following the environmental guidelines, standards, and rules that we have in place in the United States. So it really, there's a NIMBY attitude as far as extraction and mining in the U.S., and that is, I think, one of the worst environmental decisions that people can make, because we do it in a much cleaner fashion and following rules and standards that no one else in the world has.
And maybe to add to his question, the more I rely on this tablet and the less I'm relying on this piece of paper, the more energy I'm going to be using, right? And the more that, as Mark Andreessen out west says, software is eating the world, the more we're relying on these electronics, that's going to increase not just our greenhouse gas emissions, but also it's going to challenge our existing energy infrastructure, our outdated power grid. What role is the EPA playing in helping to ensure that our energy infrastructure is modern and efficient?
Well, again, that's mostly outside of our jurisdiction with FERC and with DOE.
Right.
But we do have a responsibility to make sure that the regulations, particularly all of our regulations across the board, don't pick winners and losers on energy sources. And we need to make sure that they're updated. The New York Times ran a hit piece on us, on the administration, saying we had over 100 rollbacks in environmental regulations. But what they didn't report, they only reported half of the equation. If you're a mathematician, you have to have both sides of the equal sign. What they did not report is almost every case, we replaced those regulations with more updated regulations based on science today. When we're replacing some of the regulations of the agency that are 10, 20, 30, 40 some years old, science has changed a lot, and we do need to go back and update our regulations, and that's one of the things we've been focusing on.
Now, we only have a moment left, so maybe we'll end on this. Needless to say, there is a presidential election coming up. Whether your time as leader of the EPA ends in January or sometime long after that, what do you want your legacy to be in leading the EPA?
When I took over the agency, I said I want to leave the agency stronger than I found it, and I believe it is stronger today than when I found it. And I believe I serve at the will of the president. He's asked me to plan for the second term. And I laid that out in my Nixon speech, and I certainly intend to be here for the next few years to implement that. But the agency, we've on every single environmental indicator, we've improved. On structural changes at the agency to make us more nimble and more efficient, we've improved. And on fulfilling President Trump's goal when he asked me to continue to clean up the air, continue to clean up the water, and continue to deregulate to help create more jobs, we've done that as well. We've proven that we can do both at the same time.
Great. Well, thank you, Administrator Wheeler, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I do want to thank our audience, both here and at our sparse audience here, and mostly at home, for joining us today. Please stay tuned to AEI's website for future events online.